Tonight we're stepping into the world of kings and courts, of crowns, laws, and decisions that shaped whole peoples. This is the story of the greatest kings in history. We will move slowly through their lives, their choices, and the marks they left on the world. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always quietly comforting to know who else is settling down to the same gentle story. So dim the lights, let the calm settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin with the tales of these rulers. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in the Kingdom of Macedonia, in the northern part of the Greek world. His father, Philip II, had transformed Macedonia from a collection of tribes and small territories into a stronger and more organized state. Philip built a professional army and used both diplomacy and force to expand his control over the Greek city-states to the south. His mother, Olympias, came from the kingdom of Epirus and was known for her intensity and strong religious devotion. In this household, the young Alexander grew up in a culture that valued military skill, political acumen, and loyalty to family and king. From an early age, Alexander showed energy and interest in the activities that mattered in his environment. He was trained in riding, hunting, and the use of weapons. These were practical skills for a boy in a royal household where military duty was expected. Tutors and guardians taught him the customs and expectations of Macedonian aristocracy. Meanwhile, the presence of courtiers, soldiers, and visiting envoys exposed him to the wider world of Greek politics and the ambitions of his father. When Alexander was a teenager, Philip arranged for Aristotle to be his tutor. Aristotle arrived at the Macedonian court and established a school for the prince and other young nobles. The instruction covered a range of subjects. Philosophy was central, and Aristotle introduced ideas about logic, ethics, and the nature of knowledge. Lessons in literature brought Homer and other poets into the prince's attention. Science and observation had a place as well. Aristotle encouraged careful thinking about the natural world and practical knowledge. In this way, Alexander developed habits of thought that combined a taste for action with a capacity for reflection. The relationship with Aristotle was more than a formal arrangement. The tutor provided Alexander with a framework for understanding Greek culture and its achievements. Over time, this education reinforced Alexander's identity as a Greek leader. It also gave him tools to assess different peoples and systems when he later encountered them. Yet the influence of Aristotle did not remove Alexander's practical concerns. Military training resumed. In his late teens, he saw combat and took part in campaigns. This hands-on experience complemented the theoretical lessons and helped form a leader who could command troops in the field while understanding broader questions of governance and culture. Philip's successes set the stage for Alexander's early rule. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated, and Alexander, then about 20 years old, became king. The transition was sudden and sharp. Political rivals and restless regions tested the new monarch. He moved quickly to secure his position. Revolts and plots occurred, but Alexander acted with decisiveness. Meanwhile, he confirmed Macedonian dominance over the Greek city-states and prepared for a campaign that his father had planned against the Persian Empire. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor and began a long series of military campaigns. He brought with him a trained army composed of the Macedonian phalanx, light infantry, and a heavy cavalry unit known as the companion cavalry. Command structures were clear and rehearsed. Strategy and logistics mattered as much as bravery. At the river Granicus, his forces fought against satrapal troops of the Persian Empire and won a first significant victory. This success opened the western coast of Asia Minor and allowed Alexander to secure supply lines and local support. The campaign moved south and east. In 333 BCE, he fought Darius III, the Persian king, at Issus. The two armies met in a narrow coastal plain, and the tactical decisions on the day made a decisive difference. Alexander's cavalry and coordinated use of the phalanx broke through Persian lines. Darius fled, leaving behind his family and a substantial amount of treasure. This battle damaged Persian authority and increased Alexander's reputation among his troops and among the peoples he encountered. After Issus, Alexander continued down the eastern Mediterranean. He laid siege to Tyre, a city with strong defenses and a position on an island. The siege was long and required engineering effort and persistence. In the end, Alexander's forces took the city. He then moved into Egypt, where local rulers met him with less resistance than Persian garrisons had. Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule, and in 331 BCE, he was formally recognized in Memphis. Within Egypt, he founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast. This new city would be planned with trade and administration in mind, and it would later become a center for learning and exchange. At the same time, the campaign against Darius continued. Near Gaugamela, in 331 BCE, the two forces met again. Darius had gathered a large army and hoped to use his numbers to his advantage. Alexander used a combination of disciplined infantry formations and mobile cavalry to strike at weak points in the Persian line. The result was another victory for Alexander. Darius fled once more, and his empire began to fracture as satraps and local rulers adjusted to the changing balance of power. In this way, the Persian heartland fell under Alexander's control, and he moved through Babylon and Susa, taking possession of palaces and treasures. He adopted some Persian administrative practices, showing a willingness to learn from the systems he encountered. After the fall of Central Persia, Alexander's ambitions pushed him further east. He moved through what is now Iran and into Central Asia, confronting local rulers and difficult terrain. His campaigns involved a combination of battle, negotiation, and the founding of cities. Over time, he established administrative centers and placed Macedonian and Greek settlers in strategic locations. Meanwhile, his troops had to adapt to long marches and the governance of newly conquered peoples. For a time, these measures worked to secure his lines of communication and control. In 326 BCE, Alexander reached the Indus Basin and fought the Indian king Porus at the Hydaspes River. The battle tested both sides, and Alexander's army faced elements with different equipment and tactics. Despite the challenge, his forces won, and he respected Porus's bravery. He reinstated Porus as a regional ruler and allowed him a degree of autonomy. After this, Alexander planned to continue further into India, but his soldiers, weary after years of campaigning and facing the prospect of unknown lands, grew reluctant. Near the Hyphasis River, a clear limit appeared. The army demanded to return home. In response, Alexander halted his eastward advance and accepted their decision. The return journey was not simple. Alexander chose to move by different routes, including a sea voyage with many ships and a difficult overland passage through the Gedrosian Desert. These movements cost lives and tested his capacity to supply and lead large forces across long distances. By the time he reached Babylon in 323 BCE, political management of the vast territory remained a major task. Plans for future campaigns and policies existed, but Alexander's life ended suddenly in Babylon at the age of 32. His death raised questions about succession and the future of his empire. In the years after Alexander's death, his generals, known as the Diadochi, divided the territories among themselves. None of them could fully restore the unity that Alexander had briefly achieved. Instead, several Hellenistic kingdoms emerged, each blending Greek institutions with local practices. Over time, this produced a cultural environment that historians call the Hellenistic world. Greek language remained a common medium of administration and commerce across a wide area. New cities bearing Greek names and founded with Greek planning and legal forms appeared from Egypt to Central Asia. The cultural effects of Alexander's campaigns went beyond mere political rearrangement. Art, architecture, and ideas moved across regions that had previously been more separated. Greek sculpture and urban layouts influenced local traditions, while local art and religious practices entered Greek artistic themes. Philosophical schools in Greek cities continued and changed. Meanwhile, new centers of learning appeared. Alexandria in Egypt became especially important, hosting scholars, libraries, and institutions that collected books and supported scientific inquiry. In this way, knowledge circulated in new directions. Language played a central role in this cultural exchange. Over time, a common form of Greek called koine developed and served as a practical means of communication. Merchants, administrators, and scholars used it across vast distances. This linguistic unity aided trade and diplomacy. It also helped the spread of written texts and ideas. Through coins, inscriptions, and official decrees, Greek language and imagery became familiar to people in many different regions. Governance under the Hellenistic kingdoms took varied forms. Some rulers adopted local administrative practices and worked with established elites. Others imposed Greek institutions more directly. In many cases, mixed arrangements developed. Marriage alliances and the settlement of veterans in new colonies created social ties between Greek settlers and local populations. Over time, a degree of cultural blending occurred in cities and borderlands. Artisans and traders found markets for their goods. Religious practices sometimes adopted elements from different traditions. In this way, daily life in many places reflected a mixture of Greek and local customs. The legacy of Alexander also shaped military and political ideas. His use of combined arms, mobility, and engineering influenced later commanders and states. Moreover, the idea that one ruler could bring together a vast and diverse territory under a single administration remained part of political thinking in later centuries. The Romans, for their part, looked to Alexander as a model of conquest and also absorbed some Hellenistic cultural forms. Over time, the presence of Greek cities and institutions in the Eastern Mediterranean created a bridge between the classical Greek world and later Roman and Byzantine structures. Finally, Alexander's story became a subject of history and legend. Ancient writers recorded his actions, and later historians debated his motives and methods. Over many centuries, his image took different shapes depending on the concerns of writers and rulers. Some emphasized his military genius, others his role as a cultural transmitter, and still others his failures and excesses. In factual terms, his campaigns altered political boundaries and created networks of trade and communication. Cultural exchanges continued for generations. Cities he founded served as centers for administration and learning. In this way, his brief life had long-term effects. As we consider Alexander's life, it is useful to keep both the immediate facts and the long-term outcomes in mind. He grew up in a Macedonian court, learned from Aristotle, and led an army that moved across continents. He founded cities and mixed administrative practices. Over time, his conquests helped spread Greek language and institutions, while also absorbing local traditions. The Hellenistic world that followed was neither wholly Greek nor wholly local. It represented a new pattern of cultural and political interaction that shaped the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East for centuries. In this steady and factual way, Alexander's career becomes clear. A series of actions that changed boundaries, created new centers of learning, and encouraged exchanges of ideas and goods across a wide area. The story of Cyrus the Great begins with a set of small, neighboring communities in the region we now call southwestern Iran. These were not yet a single state, but they shared language, customs, and leadership tied to tribal lineages. Over time, one family, claiming descent from a figure known as Achaemens, rose to prominence among the Persians. Their center was in an area called Anshan, and they maintained contacts with larger neighbors, including the Medes to the north. In this environment, a young leader emerged who would bring these groups together and then move beyond them. Cyrus inherited a position in a modest kingdom, and he faced immediate political realities. The Medes held a dominant position in the region and exercised influence over several smaller states. Meanwhile, local rulers and tribal chiefs still held considerable autonomy. Against this backdrop, Cyrus began to act. He first secured his own base of support and then challenged Median control. In a series of campaigns, he overcame Median forces and their king, Astyages. The victory marked a turning point. It allowed Cyrus to claim not only independence, but also a role as a unifying ruler for multiple peoples. Once freed from Median domination, Cyrus expanded in several directions. To the west lay the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, the seat of King Croesus. The conflict with Lydia proved decisive. Cyrus's forces moved into Anatolia and defeated Croesus after a campaign that combined military action with careful planning. The conquest brought control of coastal regions and access to Mediterranean trade. To the east and south, he turned toward the great city-states and territories of Mesopotamia. Babylon, the center of a long-standing civilization, became a primary objective. The capture of Babylon in 539 BCE stands out in this story. The city had been an established center of administration, religion, and culture for centuries. Cyrus approached the conquest with a combination of military skill and attention to the political and religious structures that held the city together. According to contemporary records, he entered Babylon with relatively little destruction of the city itself. Temples and palaces continued to function. He made deliberate moves to win the support of local priests and officials. A document that later became known as the Cyrus Cylinder records some of these actions and the official justification that was offered for his rule. In it, Cyrus presented himself as a restorer of traditional cults and as a ruler who respected the gods and the institutions of Babylon. The early Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus thus grew quickly in area and diversity. It included peoples speaking different languages and practicing different religions. It reached from the eastern reaches of present-day Iran to the Aegean coast, and it incorporated the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. Managing such a territory required systems of administration and methods for governing distant provinces. Cyrus and his advisors developed practices that aimed to provide order without destroying local structures. One of the central features of this administrative approach was a practice of tolerance toward local customs and religious institutions. Rather than impose a single culture or a single religious system, the imperial policy allowed a degree of continuity for local elites and priests. Temples were maintained, cultic calendars were respected, and local laws remained in force in many places. In this way, the empire functioned as a collection of regions, each with its own traditions, linked by political authority and by common rules for taxation and loyalty. Administrative organization took concrete shape in the satrapy system. The empire was divided into provinces, each overseen by a governor or satrap. These officials were responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining local order, and supplying troops when required. At the same time, central institutions in the royal court set standards for coinage, weights, and measures. Communication across the empire became increasingly important. A network of roads and stations developed to speed the movement of messages and goods. These logistic structures allowed the central administration to remain aware of developments in distant provinces, and they helped bind the diverse regions together. In matters of religion and local custom, the imperial policy showed practical restraint. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he allowed the continuation of Babylonian religious life. He returned cult objects that had been taken by previous rulers. He supported the restoration of temples and religious rites. In Egypt and other lands, later rulers would follow a similar pattern, showing respect for local gods and sacred places. This approach eased the integration of conquered peoples into the imperial structure. It also reduced the need for constant force to maintain order, because local leaders could continue to perform their roles. The question of the Jewish people and their life in Babylon provides a clear example of these policies. Many Jews had been brought to Babylon after earlier campaigns. Cyrus issued decrees that permitted those who wished to return to their ancestral lands to do so, and he supported the rebuilding of their sacred center in Jerusalem. He authorized funds and materials for the reconstruction of the temple there. For those who stayed in Babylon, Jewish communities continued to practice their religion. This action has been recorded in both Babylonian documents and in later biblical texts. Over time, it became a central element of the memory of Cyrus's rule in Jewish tradition. Beyond religious tolerance, imperial governance also included legal and economic measures. Local courts and legal traditions remained in many provinces, but central oversight ensured that imperial interests were defended. Tribute and taxes were standardized to a degree, while allowances were made for local conditions. Trade was encouraged. Ports and roads became active routes for merchants. In this way, the empire fostered economic links among regions that had previously been separated by political barriers. These links supported the flow of goods, ideas, and people across a wide area. At the core of imperial identity lay a model of rulership that combined respect for local authority with a clear central power. The king retained ultimate control over military force, major appointments, and the direction of foreign policy. At the same time, he governed through local officials and incorporated local elites into the administrative fabric. Military garrisons and loyal contingents ensured security where needed. Meanwhile, the presence of satraps and inspectors helped to coordinate activities across the empire. Regular reporting systems and an organized treasury gave the central court practical tools for governance. Architectural and material projects also reflected the aims of this model empire. Cyrus founded a capital at Pasargadae, where he built a palace and a tomb. The tomb itself was simple in design and was meant to mark the resting place of a ruler whose authority had been recognized across many lands. Building projects included palaces and administrative centers in other locations. These structures combined local styles with imperial forms. They served administrative functions, they housed officials, and they embodied the presence of the king in various provinces. Over time, the reputation of Cyrus the Great grew beyond the immediate facts of conquest and governance. Contemporary and later writers noted his approach to rule. Some praised his restraint and his attention to local customs. Others emphasized his military abilities and his capacity to form political alliances. Historians in later centuries looked back and saw in his reign the foundations of a durable imperial order in the Near East. His successors maintained many of the practices he had put in place, and they extended the territorial boundaries of the empire. In this way, the administrative system, once tested by Cyrus, continued to influence political life for generations. The legacy of Cyrus also reached into cultural memory. Documents and inscriptions from his reign were preserved and referenced by later rulers. The Cyrus cylinder, for example, was known in antiquity and rediscovered in modern times. It became a source of information about how Cyrus presented himself to conquered peoples and how he sought to legitimize his rule. Literary sources in different languages, including Greek and Hebrew, preserved accounts that portrayed him in various lights. Some described him as a liberator, others as a pragmatic ruler who sought stability. In all accounts, his role as the founder of an empire remained central. Institutions developed under Cyrus provided models for subsequent administrations. The satrapy system, the use of local elites, the network of roads and communications, and the policies toward local religions were adopted and adapted by later rulers in the region. These elements offered a tested set of tools for managing diverse territories. Over time, scholars and officials in later states would draw on these practices when they faced similar challenges of governing multi-ethnic lands. As we consider the life and rule of Cyrus, it is useful to think of several linked developments. First, a small regional power in Persia grew through military skill and political negotiation into a far-reaching empire. Second, the administration developed practical mechanisms to manage diversity, combining central authority with local autonomy. Third, policies of religious tolerance and the restoration of local institutions eased the integration of conquered peoples. Finally, the example set by Cyrus and his immediate successors created a model that influenced the organization of empire in the Near East for many years. Cyrus died in 530 BCE, and his burial place at Pasargadae remained a site of remembrance. His successors continued to expand and to refine the structures he had set in motion. In this way, his brief lifetime had longer consequences. The empire that he founded lasted under Achaemenid rule for more than 2 centuries, providing a stable framework for trade, administration, and cultural exchange across a wide area. In remembering Cyrus the Great, historians note both the military achievements that created the empire and the administrative choices that made it possible to hold together. The calm, systematic practices of governance and the deliberate respect for local customs combined to produce a durable model of imperial rule. Over time, this model shaped political and cultural life in the Near East, and it left records that help us understand how one ruler found ways to govern many peoples. The story of Ashoka the Great begins in a time of rapid change on the Indian subcontinent. In the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, states grew larger and more centralized than the small kingdoms that had existed earlier. One of the most important of these new powers was the Maurya Empire. It formed through a series of political moves and military campaigns, led first by Chandragupta Maurya, who overthrew the older Nanda dynasty and gathered control over much of northern India. His son Bindusara carried on the work of consolidation and expansion, and by the time Ashoka was born into the royal family, the Maurya state already covered an extensive territory from the eastern to the northwestern frontiers of the subcontinent. Ashoka grew up in the context of an empire that required strong administration and a capable military. He was one of several princes, and he learned the arts of governance and warfare that were expected of a member of the ruling house. When he came to power, probably around 268 BCE, the empire was already a major force in South Asia. The central court at Pataliputra, located by the great riverine routes, served as the hub of authority. Officials, tax collectors, and a standing army supported the rule of the Maurya kings. In this environment, Ashoka inherited not only territory, but also the institutions that made large-scale rule possible. Early in his reign, Ashoka continued policies that aimed to secure and extend Mauryan control. The empire maintained garrisons in key regions, and military expeditions were common tools for dealing with recalcitrant regions or for asserting authority at the edges of the realm. Ashoka's early record includes campaigns in the northwest and efforts to bring the Deccan regions under imperial control. These actions reflected a traditional approach to rulership in which strength and the willingness to use force were central elements. One campaign, however, stands out for its scale and for the change it brought to Ashoka personally and to the course of his rule. The kingdom of Kalinga, located on the eastern coast where the modern state of Odisha now lies, had long been an independent and prosperous region. It controlled important ports and inland trade routes. In the third year of Ashoka's reign, he launched a major effort to bring Kalinga into the Maurya orbit. The resulting conflict, often called the Kalinga War, was large and destructive by the standards of the age. Fighting took place on land and near the rivers, and many thousands of people were killed. According to inscriptions that Ashoka himself had set up later, a large number died, many more were deported, and large numbers of families were made homeless. The immediate military result of the campaign was clear. Kalinga's political independence was broken, and the region became part of the Maurya Empire. The victory brought control of important coastal territory and secured access to maritime trade. At the same time, the human cost of the confrontation had a profound effect. Ashoka recorded his own reaction to the suffering he had caused. He spoke of being deeply moved by the sight of so much death and displacement. This reaction was not limited to private remorse. It led to a notable transformation in how he understood the purpose of kingship. Following the Kalinga campaign, Ashoka underwent a change in outlook that historical tradition links to the adoption of Buddhism. The precise sequence of events and the personal motives involved are described differently in various early texts and inscriptions, but the broad pattern is consistent. He turned away from an exclusive reliance on military force and toward an emphasis on moral and ethical principles as guides for government. Buddhism, as one of the major religious systems in India at the time, provided a set of teachings about compassion, restraint, and the alleviation of suffering. Ashoka embraced these teachings in a practical manner. He did not abandon his position as emperor, but he began to use the authority of the throne to promote policies grounded in ethical concerns. To communicate his new priorities, Ashoka made use of inscriptions carved on rocks and pillars across the empire. These edicts, written in local languages and placed in public locations, explained his principles and the actions he intended to take. They began by outlining a general policy of moral improvement and then moved to concrete administrative measures. The language of the edicts uses the term Dhamma or Dharma, which in this context refers to a set of ethical behaviors and social responsibilities. Ashoka urged respect, kindness, and honesty. He encouraged people to treat others fairly, to avoid harming living beings needlessly, and to practice self-control. He also promoted religious tolerance, insisting that followers of different traditions should be treated with respect and should have the freedom to practice their faiths. Administration under Ashoka adjusted to reflect these moral aims. Officials with new responsibilities were appointed to oversee the propagation of the Dhamma and to monitor the welfare of the populace. These officers, sometimes called Dhamma Mahamatras in the inscriptions, were tasked with spreading ethical instruction, resolving disputes, and reporting on conditions in the provinces. In this way, moral teaching became linked to formal governance. Meanwhile, the existing structures of satraps, provincial governors, and the central bureaucracy continued to manage taxation, law, and security. The result was a combination of traditional administrative techniques with a stronger official emphasis on ethical governance. Practical measures accompanied the moral rhetoric. Ashoka's inscriptions and other early accounts describe public works intended to reduce suffering and to improve daily life. Planting trees along roads, digging wells, and building rest houses for travelers are among the activities recorded. Medical care received official support. Ashoka ordered the establishment of facilities for the treatment of both humans and animals. In some regions, physicians were appointed and medicines were provided at public expense. These programs reached beyond the court and into local communities. Over time, they created a record of state involvement in basic welfare that was unusual for the period. Animal protection also featured in official directives. Hunting for sport was discouraged, and the wounding or killing of certain animals was forbidden in many contexts. Wild and domesticated animals were to be treated with care. From the standpoint of policy, these measures aimed to reduce sources of unnecessary harm and to set a moral example for subjects. They also reflected the influence of Buddhist and other ethical ideas that emphasized nonviolence and compassion. Ashoka used the resources of the state in ways that reflected both moral aims and the realities of empire. He maintained a standing army and the capacity to respond to threats. At the same time, he limited the use of force when alternate measures were possible. In international relations, he sought peaceful contacts and diplomatic ties. Envoys and missions were sent to neighboring states and to more distant courts. Buddhist missionaries were dispatched to regions beyond the subcontinent, including to Sri Lanka, where recorded traditions credit them with establishing Buddhism as an organized presence. Missions reached Central Asia, and according to some accounts, even parts of the Hellenistic world. These efforts mixed religious outreach with standard diplomatic practice. The rock and pillar edicts provide a sustained explanation of policy and principle. They are notable for their clarity and for the way they blend moral exhortation with administrative instruction. The inscriptions address not only officials, but also ordinary people. They give practical advice on conduct and emphasize the mutual responsibilities of king and subjects. In one passage, Ashoka explains that the aim of rule should be the welfare of all who live under it. He uses concrete examples to show how the state should act. By caring for the needy, by treating prisoners with humanity, and by promoting education in ethical behavior. In this way, the edicts become both a statement of principle and a manual for governance. Religious tolerance remained a central theme. Ashoka urged respect for multiple traditions and called for harmonious coexistence. His policy did not seek to impose Buddhism on all subjects. Instead, it supported the moral teachings of Buddhism while recognizing the value of other faiths. Representatives of different communities were encouraged to explain their teachings to others in a spirit of respect. Over time, this official stance promoted a degree of pluralism in many parts of the empire. Administration kept careful records, and Ashoka's system included inspectors who monitored the implementation of policies. Tribute and taxation continued to fund public works and the central court. Legal processes were maintained, with local customary law operating alongside imperial oversight. In matters of justice, the edicts call for fair treatment and for penalties that fit the offense. The emphasis was on restraint and on correction rather than on excessive punishment. In practical terms, this meant that the state used its authority to preserve order while trying to limit unnecessary cruelty. The material remnants of Ashoka's reign are visible in archaeological sites and in the surviving inscriptions. Pillars carved with inscriptions and topped by sculpted capitals once marked important locations. The most famous of these capitals, depicting 4 lions, was discovered at Sarnath and later became a symbol used in modern times to represent the independent state of India. The physical reach of the edicts, carved on rocks and pillars across many regions, indicates an intention to communicate widely. Their language is direct and accessible, and their distribution shows that the central authority wanted its message to be known in distant provinces, as well as in the capital. Ashoka's death around 232 BCE marked the end of a long and significant reign. After his passing, the Maurya Empire gradually weakened. Succession disputes and regional pressures led to a decline that culminated in the collapse of the dynasty within a few decades. Despite the political decline, the institutional and moral experiments of Ashoka had longer-term effects. Buddhism continued to spread and to develop as a major social force in South Asia and beyond. The idea that a ruler should be concerned with the welfare of common people, and that moral principles could be part of official policy, influenced later generations of rulers and officials. Historians have debated the depth and sincerity of Ashoka's conversion and the practical limits of his policies. Some question how fully the ideals expressed in the edicts were realized on the ground. Local elites and practical constraints sometimes limited the reach of central policy. Still, the documented intention to rule according to ethical principles stands as an important historical fact. For many later writers and religious traditions, Ashoka became a model of a ruler who sought to combine authority with moral accountability. Over time, Ashoka passed into both historical record and cultural memory. Buddhist texts preserved stories of his life and of his support for monastic institutions. Inscriptions and archaeological remains continued to attract attention, and in the modern era scholars studied the edicts as primary evidence of a ruler who deliberately shaped public morality. The career of Ashoka thus offers a clear example of how political power and moral ideas can be brought together. He used the mechanisms of empire, the court, the bureaucracy, and the public inscription to promote a set of ethical goals while maintaining the capacity to govern a large and diverse territory. In looking back at Ashoka's reign, it is useful to note several connected developments. First, a large and centralized state provided the means for broad social and administrative programs. Second, the experience of war, especially the events at Kalinga, prompted a rethinking of the use of force and of the obligations of rulers toward their subjects. Third, religious and ethical ideas, particularly those associated with Buddhism, shaped concrete policies that touched everyday life. Finally, public inscriptions made those policies visible and gave later generations a clear record of the aims that guided rule. The story ends with the record left on stone and pillar. The edicts remain readable in places where they were carved more than 2,000 years ago. They speak in plain terms about conduct, responsibility, and care. In that way, Ashoka's reign continues to be accessible to those who study the past. The combination of statecraft and moral concern that marks his rule remains a subject of reflection. Over time, his records and the accounts that preserve his memory help us understand how one ruler sought to align power with ethical purpose, and how that effort shaped the lives of many people across a broad region. Charlemagne was one of the most significant rulers of the early medieval period. He lived at a time when political structures were changing across Western Europe. In this narration, I will describe the background of the Frankish kingdom in which he rose, the campaigns by which he expanded his rule across Western and Central Europe, the circumstances of his coronation as emperor in the year 800, and the cultural revival that became known as the Carolingian Renaissance. The aim is to follow events clearly and calmly, to explain what happened and why it mattered, and to do so in a steady, plain style. The story begins with the Frankish kingdom that Charlemagne inherited and helped to transform. The Franks were a collection of Germanic peoples who had settled in Roman Gaul and built political power in the centuries that followed the collapse of central Roman authority. Early Frankish kings from the Merovingian dynasty held kingship by hereditary right. But over time, real power often passed to officials called mayors of the palace. Those officials managed the royal household and the realm's practical affairs. By the 8th century, the house of the Carolingians, which included Charles Martel and his son Pepin the Short, had become dominant. Charles Martel had gained fame for military successes, and Pepin secured the title of king with the support of the papacy. In this way, the Carolingians combined military leadership with ecclesiastical backing. Charlemagne was born into this family and came of age in a world of shifting authority and active warfare. He was the eldest son of Pepin the Short and Bertrada of Laon. When Pepin died in 768, the kingdom passed to his sons. Initially, the realm was divided between Charlemagne and his brother Carloman, as was customary in Frankish succession. The division created tension. Carloman's early death in 771 left Charlemagne as sole ruler of the Frankish lands. He then set about consolidating control and establishing his authority over a larger domain. His early years as king included managing relationships with local magnates, with bishops, and with neighboring peoples. Over time, he combined military action with administrative reform to create a stronger, more centralized position. Expansion was one of the defining features of Charlemagne's reign. From the late 8th century onward, he led a series of campaigns that extended Frankish control across much of Western and Central Europe. Between 772 and 804, he fought the long and brutal Saxon Wars. The Saxons were a collection of tribes in what is now northern Germany. They resisted Frankish rule and the pressure to convert to Christianity. Charlemagne pursued them in repeated campaigns, and he incorporated their lands into his realm through a mixture of military force, resettlement policies, and religious measures. The process was slow and often violent. It involved the suppression of rebellions and the establishment of Frankish and Christian institutions in newly controlled areas. To the south, Charlemagne intervened in the Italian peninsula. The Lombards controlled large parts of northern Italy and posed a strategic concern for the Franks. In 774, Charlemagne invaded Lombard territory, defeated King Desiderius, and assumed the title king of the Lombards. This action secured Frankish influence in northern Italy and reinforced ties with the papacy, which sought protection against Lombard aggression. Over time, Charlemagne's presence in Italy became an important element of his power on the continent. He built relationships with Italian bishops and leaders, and he supervised the administration of territories that included former Lombard lands. In the East, Charlemagne engaged with Avar groups and with Slavic peoples along the Danube. Campaigns against the Avars in the 790s dismantled their power in the Pannonian Basin and added territories to Frankish control. He also gained influence over Bavarian lands and brought duchies, such as Bavaria, into closer association with the central authority. To the west, Charlemagne sent forces into what is now northeastern Spain. The Franks established the so-called Spanish March as a buffer zone against Muslim Iberian powers to the south. These actions created a wide perimeter of influence across multiple regions. Over time, he combined military conquest with arrangements that allowed local elites to remain in place under Frankish sovereignty. Administration evolved alongside expansion. Charlemagne appointed counts and other local officials to govern territories in his name. These officials were responsible for raising troops, collecting revenues, and enforcing royal justice. To check the power of local magnates and to ensure central oversight, he established a system in which royal envoys, the missi dominici, traveled to inspect local administration. The missi were often pairs composed of a lay noble and a bishop or cleric. They reported directly to the king and helped maintain a link between the center and far-flung provinces. In this way, Charlemagne tried to make rule effective across a geographically large and diverse realm. Another important aspect of his rule was his relationship with the church. Charlemagne worked closely with bishops and abbots, and he relied on the church to help govern and to provide educated personnel. Religious conversion was often a part of military expansion, especially in the Saxon territories, where conversion to Christianity was paired with political submission. In some cases, this policy included forced measures and harsh penalties for resistance. At the same time, Charlemagne promoted ecclesiastical reform, supported monastic foundations, and sought to standardize liturgical practices. He intended that the church would be a partner in consolidating unity across his realm. The year 800 marks a key moment in Charlemagne's career. On Christmas Day of that year, he was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III in Rome. The events leading to that moment involved both political calculation and symbolic gesture. The papacy had faced threats and needed protection. Charlemagne had entered Rome on several occasions to defend papal interests and to adjudicate disputes. By crowning Charlemagne as emperor, Pope Leo sought to reinforce the authority of the papal office and to align the papacy with a powerful secular ruler. Charlemagne, for his part, accepted the title, but did not immediately assume all the trappings of imperial court life in the same way as later medieval emperors. He viewed the coronation as a recognition of authority that complemented his existing kingship. In broader terms, the event revived the idea of a Western Roman Empire. It placed Charlemagne in a long political tradition and created a new model of Christian monarchy in the West. The imperial title had multiple consequences. It gave Charlemagne a claim to a universal Christian rulership in the West, and it established a renewed link between the papal and imperial offices. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire to the east did not at once accept this revival of Western imperial status. Relations with Constantinople continued to be shaped by diplomacy, by mutual suspicion, and by occasional alliance. Over time, the Carolingian imperial idea influenced later medieval political thought about kingship and empire. The coronation remains a pivotal moment in European history because it shaped institutions of authority for centuries. Alongside military and political activity, Charlemagne took a strong interest in reforming government and in encouraging learning. His initiatives in this area are grouped under the term Carolingian Renaissance. The revival was not a sudden rebirth of classical civilization, but it was a significant effort to renew education, to improve the quality of clergy and officials, and to preserve texts. Charlemagne invited scholars and clerics from different regions to his court. Among them was Alcuin of York, a learned teacher who became a leading figure in the palace school. Alcuin and others worked on curriculum, on the teaching of Latin, and on the copying of manuscripts. The palace school trained not only clerics, but also members of the nobility. In this way, literacy and learning were promoted among those who would govern and administer the realm. Scriptoria in monasteries and cathedrals produced copies of religious and classical texts. Over time, the copying effort rescued many works from loss and helped standardize the Latin language used in liturgy and administration. A clear achievement of this period was the development of a new, more legible script, now called Carolingian minuscule. This script made texts easier to read and transmit, and it became a model for later medieval manuscripts. In this way, the hands of scribes and the rules they followed had a practical effect on the preservation of knowledge. Educational and liturgical reform went hand in hand. Charlemagne issued capitularies, which were written orders and regulations that addressed the conduct of clergy, the administration of sacraments, and the organization of church life. He insisted that priests be better educated and able to read and explain the scriptures to their congregations. Schools attached to monasteries and cathedrals were encouraged to teach grammar, arithmetic, and basic canonical law. In this way, the kingdom sought to raise standards of religious practice and to create a more uniform ecclesiastical culture across diverse regions. Legal and administrative reforms were practical matters as well. Charlemagne issued a series of capitularies covering matters of law, taxation, military obligations, and the duties of officials. They functioned as guidance for counts and other administrators. While enforcement varied by locality, the existence of written regulations helped center governance on royal directives. Meanwhile, monetary and fiscal arrangements helped sustain military campaigns and public projects. Charlemagne also promoted infrastructures, such as roads and bridges where possible, and he encouraged commerce across internal borders. These measures were aimed at stabilizing and integrating the diverse territories under his authority. Charlemagne's interest in culture extended to the arts and to architecture. He sponsored building projects, including church construction in Aachen, which served as a royal center. He collected relics and supported artistic production that often followed ecclesiastical models. Manuscript illumination and metalwork from the period reflect an interaction between late antique forms and Northern European styles. In this way, material culture under Charlemagne combined practical, liturgical, and symbolic functions. By the time of his death in 814, Charlemagne had created an empire that covered much of what is now France, Germany, northern Italy, and neighboring regions. The political entity he assembled did not remain intact under a single ruler for long after his death. Succession arrangements divided the empire among his heirs, and subsequent generations faced pressures from internal divisions and external invasions. Nonetheless, the institutions and ideas developed during his reign had long-term effects. The model of a Christian monarchy linked to the papacy, the administrative practices that sought centralized oversight, and the cultural investments that preserved learning, all shaped the medieval West. In assessing Charlemagne's legacy, it is useful to note both achievements and limitations. He achieved territorial expansion and a degree of administrative cohesion. He fostered a revival of learning and a standardization of practices across a wide area. At the same time, his rule depended on personal leadership, on a network of local elites, and on a sometimes coercive approach to conversion and control. Regional variation persisted, and the coherence of the empire relied on continuous military and political effort. The narrative of Charlemagne's life and rule offers a clear view of how a ruler in the early medieval world could combine force, administration, religious alliance, and cultural policy. He lived in a time of transition. Over time, his actions shaped political and intellectual currents that would matter for centuries. The combination of military campaigns, careful administration, support for the church, and investment in learning provides a coherent picture of his aims and methods. In that way, the reign of Charlemagne stands as a central chapter in the formation of medieval European institutions and culture. He was born under difficult circumstances on the open grasslands that people now call the Mongolian steppes. The boy later known as Genghis Khan was given the name Temujin. His birth took place around the early 1160s, and his early years were defined by scarcity and insecurity. His father, Yesuje, was a minor chief who provided leadership to a small following, but the world of steppe politics was unstable. When Temujin was still a child, his father was poisoned while returning from an alliance-building trip. The household lost its protector. In the years that followed, the family was abandoned by their own clan. They faced hunger, the loss of herds, and a precarious social position. In this way, Temujin learned early the costs of weakness and the demands of survival. The hardships of childhood included direct threats to his life and freedom. At one point, he was captured by a rival group and held as a slave. He escaped or was released, and he then began to gather a small following. Marriage to Bort was an important step in his youth. The marriage created political ties, but it also led to further trials. Bort was captured by a rival group known as the Merkits and held for some time. Temujin organized a rescue with the help of allies, and the event strengthened his personal network. Over time, he assembled companions and supporters who would form the core of his later power. The process of unifying the Mongol tribes involved a mix of negotiation, alliance-making, and military action. Temujin cultivated friendships with men of different backgrounds, including noble lineages and followers of lower status. He used marriage ties, personal loyalty, and shared spoils to bind people to his cause. Meanwhile, rival leaders pursued their own claims. One of the most important relationships of this period was with Jamaka, who was at first a friend and a formal blood brother. They later became rivals. Conflicts arose over leadership and over different visions of how the steppe should be governed. Where Jamaka represented older patterns of aristocratic privilege, Temujin proposed a more flexible system that rewarded ability and loyalty rather than birth alone. Over time, this approach won him many recruits. Temujin also dealt with external enemies among the steppe peoples. He fought against the Tatars, the Merkits, the Nayman, and others who resisted his expansion. Victories in battle increased his reputation, and they brought additional followers into his camp. He reorganized the forces under his command into units based on tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. These arrangements created reliable structures for command and supply. In this way, the Mongol army became efficient and cohesive. Discipline and clear chains of authority were emphasized, and promotions were often granted for merit and loyalty. By 1206, a wide assembly of Mongol leaders met to decide a new political order. The meeting, called a Kurultai, confirmed Temujin as the supreme leader of the Mongols. At that moment, he took the title Genghis Khan, which signaled his position as ruler over a unified confederation of tribes. The new regime established laws and practices intended to bind a diverse population. Some measures aimed to limit factionalism and to discourage internecine violence. Other provisions regulated trade, military obligations, and the movement of people. The consolidation of power did not erase local differences, but it created a framework that allowed coordinated campaigns and centralized decisions. Military campaigns under Genghis Khan expanded the reach of the Mongol state across a vast portion of Asia and into parts of Eastern Europe. The campaigns combined mobility, tactical innovation, and careful preparation. Mounted archers formed the core of the fighting force. They used speed to outmaneuver opponents, and they coordinated attacks with signals and prearranged plans. Skilled scouts collected information about terrain and enemy dispositions. Engineers and specialized units were attached when sieges were required. Over time, the Mongol armies learned to incorporate the skills of conquered peoples, including siegecraft from Chinese and Central Asian craftsmen. The first large campaigns targeted neighboring states that threatened Mongol interests or offered strategic value. The Tangut state of Western Xia in the northwest of China was an early target. Campaigns against the Jin dynasty in northern China followed, and these conflicts tested the Mongols' ability to challenge well-organized, fortified states. Cities and fortresses that resisted were besieged. In some cases, the Mongols negotiated submission and accepted tribute rather than destroying every opponent. Where resistance continued, they applied sustained pressure until control was achieved. To the west, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Islamic realms of Central Asia. A specific incident precipitated a major campaign. A trade caravan sent by Genghis Khan and its merchants were executed by local authorities in the Khwarezmian state. Envoys dispatched by the Khan were also mistreated. These events led to a decision to invade in 1219. The ensuing campaign moved rapidly along trade routes, and cities that had once prospered under long-distance commerce were confronted by well-organized Mongol armies. Samarkand and Bukhara, Kunyurganj and Merv were among those that faced sieges and violent assault. The destruction of several urban centers was severe. In some cases, local resistance was met with punitive measures that produced large-scale loss of life. In other instances, the Mongols incorporated local administrators, artisans, and merchants into their system of rule and allowed some forms of local autonomy. During the same period, Mongol forces extended their operations into areas north and west of the Caspian Sea. Skilled commanders carried out reconnaissance and punitive raids that reached the borders of the Russian principalities. In 1223, a combined force under prominent Mongol leaders engaged and defeated a coalition of Russian princes and their allies at the Kalka River. That engagement demonstrated the reach and tactical competence of the Mongol armies outside their traditional territories. Over time, Mongol pressure reshaped political arrangements in many regions beyond the immediate control of the central authority. Campaigns continued until the final years of Genghis Khan's life. He personally led or directed major operations across diverse environments, from deserts to river valleys and mountain passes. The demands of such warfare required not only military skill, but also logistical planning, diplomatic maneuvering, and an ability to adapt to local conditions. In 1227, the Khan died after completing a campaign against the Western Xia. He left an empire that covered a vast portion of Eurasia, though he did not live to see its full expansion under later generations. Administration and governance under Genghis Khan combined strict discipline with administrative innovation. He sought to create systems that maintained order across a wide and varied territory. A written legal code, often referred to as the Yasa, served as a set of rules for behavior, military duty, and social order. While the code itself was not published in a form comparable to some modern legal systems, it provided standards and penalties that were enforced by the central authority. The law stressed military obligations, loyalty, and public order. The Khan also reorganized the political and military elite. Traditional aristocratic privileges were curtailed in favor of appointments based on performance and loyalty. Commanders who proved effective in the field received authority and land, regardless of their original tribal rank. In this way, new elites emerged who owed their position to the central power. Over time, this practice altered the social composition of leadership and reduced the dominance of older noble lineages. Communication and logistics received particular attention. The Mongols established a relay system of posts and riders that could carry messages across long distances. Known as the Yam, this system linked important centers and allowed for rapid transmission of orders and information. In addition, officials were appointed to collect tax and tribute, to supervise the movement of peoples, and to oversee the settlement of skilled workers who were relocated for specialized tasks. Artisans, engineers, and administrators were often moved from conquered cities to serve in other parts of the empire. In this way, the rulers made use of human capital in addition to material resources. Religious policy under Genghis Khan reflected pragmatism and tolerance. He and his successors often allowed conquered peoples to practice their faiths. Religious leaders could usually operate within an agreed framework, and the state often exempted certain religious institutions from taxes or service in exchange for loyalty. Meanwhile, the Khan supported practical cooperation with diverse communities. He employed administrators from different cultural and religious backgrounds, and he accepted the utility of various traditions when they served governance and economic stability. Trade and economic policy were central to the Mongol approach to empire. The rulers recognized the value of long-distance commerce for revenue and for political reach. They protected merchants and caravans along major routes, and they encouraged the flow of goods between East and West. The use of passports or authorizing tablets allowed merchants certain privileges and protections. Over time, the stability imposed by Mongol rule in large parts of Eurasia created conditions that merchants could exploit. Trade flourished along the Silk Road and across connected waterways. In this way, the Mongol period fostered increased interchange of goods, technologies, and ideas. The combined effect of military conquest and administrative measures produced a legacy that was complex and far-reaching. On one hand, many cities and regions suffered severe destruction and demographic loss during the initial campaigns. The immediate human cost could be high. On the other hand, areas incorporated into the Mongol sphere experienced increased connectivity and administrative standardization. The protection of trade routes and the movement of people and goods led to economic opportunities for some communities. Over time, the circulation of ideas, technologies, and crops expanded across regions that had previously been more isolated. The institutional frameworks established by Genghis Khan endured in various forms under his successors. The empire eventually divided into several khanates, each governed by different branches of his descendants. Those successor states carried forward many of the administrative practices, legal principles, and trade policies initiated during his lifetime. In China, the Mongol rulers eventually established a new dynasty that incorporated Chinese institutions. In Persia and Central Asia, local administrative traditions adapted to Mongol oversight. In Eastern Europe, the presence of Mongol power influenced the political development of emerging states. In assessing the life and rule of Genghis Khan, it is important to recognize both his effectiveness as a military leader and his role as a state builder. He transformed a fragmented set of tribes into a political order capable of coordinated action across vast distances. He introduced systems of law, communication, and administration that enabled governance beyond simple conquest. At the same time, the methods by which these ends were achieved included violence and coercion on a scale that reshaped populations and local power structures. He died in 1227. The place of his burial was kept secret according to custom, and his remains were interred by tradition in a location known only to a few. Succession passed to his son Urgide, who continued the process of imperial expansion and institutional development. The foundations Genghis Khan laid allowed later generations to govern a wide Eurasian world and to connect regions through trade, diplomacy, and administrative practice. In the long view, his life altered the political geography of Eurasia. Military conquests opened routes and created networks. Administrative reforms created a new model of rule adapted to nomadic strengths and to the management of settled societies. Trade benefited from increased security and state support. Over time, these changes shaped the economic and political patterns of many regions and left a complex legacy that scholars continue to study. In this way, the story of Genghis Khan is both the story of a man who rose from hardship on the steppes and the story of the institutions and connections that emerged from his rule. Suleiman I came to power at a moment when the Ottoman state already stretched across 3 continents. He inherited an empire that had grown steadily under his predecessors. His grandfather had helped consolidate earlier gains, and his father had expanded the borders in the east. When Suleiman became sultan in 1520, he brought a personal energy to rule and a willingness to refine institutions that the state already used. His accession was not simply the continuation of old policies. In practice, it marked a new phase in administration, law, military organization, and cultural life. He ruled for 46 years, and those years became central to how the empire managed growth and sustained influence. Early in his reign, he relied on experienced advisors and a group of senior officials who understood both the court and the provinces. The role of the Grand Vizier was important, and the palace included a complex bureaucratic apparatus. Meanwhile, provincial governors managed tax collection, local security, and the implementation of central orders. Suleiman paid attention to these structures. Over time, he took steps to balance central control with practical delegation. He preferred officials who could execute policy and maintain stability, rather than those who simply asserted hereditary privilege. In this way, he both strengthened central authority and allowed competent administrators to rise. The legal dimension of his rule became a defining feature. Suleiman undertook a systematic effort to harmonize the existing Islamic law with sultanic decrees. These sultanic laws, known in Ottoman terms as canon, addressed areas not fully specified by religious law. Fiscal regulation, criminal punishments, military obligations, land tenure, and administrative procedures were among the topics covered. By issuing clear canons, he reduced uncertainty about governance and provided a framework for consistent decision-making. Legal scholars, judges, and administrators worked together to record these standards. The result was a more cohesive legal order that officials across the empire could reference. This legal consolidation had social and political consequences. Land law, for example, affected the relationship between the central government and the provincial cavalry, the Sipahi. The timur system linked land revenues to military service, and clarifying those links helped sustain a reliable manpower pool for campaigns. Meanwhile, urban centers saw regulations that governed trade, guilds, and public order. The Sultan also engaged with the religious establishment. He allowed the Sharia courts to operate in matters of family law and personal status. In this way, state, law, and religious law functioned in parallel, with defined responsibilities for each. Over time, these arrangements contributed to a durable administrative order. Cultural policy moved alongside legal reform. Suleiman took an active interest in the arts and in literate culture. He patronized poets, calligraphers, and writers. He himself composed verses under the pen name Muhibi, and those poems reveal a concern with both personal reflection and courtly expression. The court became a center for book production, illumination, and the compilation of histories. Scholars and craftsmen from different parts of the empire found employment and support in the capital and in the provincial centers that benefited from court patronage. Libraries and scriptoria were supported by endowments that ensured ongoing activity. Religious communities of different faiths continued to live and work inside Ottoman domains. Suleiman maintained policies that allowed recognized communities to manage certain internal affairs. The millet arrangements, which allocated space for communal self-governance in matters like family law and education, remained functional. At the same time, the state collected taxes and enforced public order. In practical terms, this meant that a range of religious minorities could practice and organize within legal limits, while central institutions maintained overall control. Military expansion occupied much of Suleiman's attention, and operations took place on many fronts. In Europe, the early 1520s brought decisive engagements. The capture of Belgrade and the conquest of Rhodes in 1522 and 1523 removed secure bases that had previously threatened Ottoman interests in the eastern Mediterranean. The campaign at Mohacs in 1526 was a major development. There, Ottoman forces defeated a large Hungarian army and created conditions that allowed Ottoman influence to expand into Central Europe. The victory reshaped the political map of the region and opened a period of political rearrangement among the Christian states of Europe. Suleiman also directed naval policy with the support of capable admirals. One of them, Hayreddin Barbarossa, rebuilt Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman fleet engaged Spanish and Venetian forces, and it established a period of naval ascendancy in the eastern and central Mediterranean. In 1538, the Ottoman fleet achieved a clear victory at Preveza, which secured sea routes and limited the ability of European fleets to operate freely in Ottoman waters. Naval strength enabled the Ottomans to project power along the coasts of Greece, the Adriatic, and the North African shores. In this way, control of the sea complemented campaigns on land. The Western and Central European frontiers, however, were also complicated by the ongoing rivalry with the Habsburgs. Charles V and his successors represented a persistent counterweight. Suleiman's forces reached the outskirts of Vienna in 1529, which marked the furthest western advance of his campaigns. That siege did not succeed, and the failure at Vienna set limits to immediate territorial expansion in Central Europe. Nevertheless, Ottoman pressure on Habsburg lands continued for decades. Diplomatic maneuvering accompanied military actions. An unusual but consequential alliance with France established mutual interests against the Habsburg orbit. Over time, this Franco-Ottoman cooperation shaped strategic choices on both sides of the Mediterranean. To the east, conflicts with the Safavid dynasty of Persia occupied significant resources. The two powers contested influence over the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and parts of eastern Anatolia. Campaigns in the 1530s and 1540s led to alternating occupations and negotiations. Sulayman's forces captured Baghdad in 1534, which had both symbolic and strategic value. That city had been a center of trade and administration for centuries. The later Treaty of Amasya in 1555 produced a defined border and a period of relative peace between the two empires. In diplomatic terms, the treaty brought stability after decades of intermittent conflict, and it allowed both states to consolidate their rule in adjacent regions. Ottoman influence in North Africa also expanded during Sulayman's reign. Local rulers allied with or accepted Ottoman protection, and coastal regions were integrated into the maritime system that the empire managed. The Mediterranean littoral from Algeria to the Levant operated under networks of control that combined military force with local accommodation. Over time, these networks facilitated trade, tax collection, and military staging points. Administration and public welfare featured prominently in Sulayman's program of rule. He invested in public works that addressed practical needs. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, caravanserais, and hospitals received funds from state treasuries and private endowments. Such projects improved communication, supported commerce, and addressed basic health and social needs. The Waqf system allowed wealthy patrons and state actors to place properties and revenues into endowments for specific charitable or institutional uses. In this way, patrons could create lasting institutions, and the state could rely on these foundations to sustain public services. Architectural patronage under Sulayman reached notable heights. He commissioned works from the imperial architect Mimar Sinan, one of the most influential builders in the empire's history. The Süleymaniye Mosque complex in Istanbul stands as a major example. It combined a principal mosque with ancillary buildings such as schools, a hospital, kitchens, and lodgings, all linked by a charitable foundation. The complex served both religious and public functions. Other projects included works in provincial cities and infrastructural improvements along important routes. Bridges and bazaars, along with smaller mosques and public baths, changed the urban landscape in practical ways. Art and material culture also flourished under court patronage. Workshops produced textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and illuminated manuscripts that reflected both local traditions and connections with broader trading networks. Tastes evolved in court circles, and artisans adapted techniques from across the empire and beyond. Music, calligraphy, and literary production received support, and the court served as one place where practitioners could gain patrons and audiences. Over time, these cultural investments reinforced the stability of elite life and signaled imperial prestige. Sulayman's personal relationships shaped political questions within the court. His long association with Hürrem Sultan, who had once been a concubine and became his legal wife, altered patterns of palace politics. Hürrem's family ties and influence affected appointments and alliances. The question of succession became sharper as the Prince Mustafa, who enjoyed significant popular and military support, was executed after accusations of disloyalty. The decision created unrest and controversy among different factions. Later conflicts among Sulayman's sons and their supporters continued to make succession a delicate matter. Eventually, Selim succeeded his father, but the process by which power transferred reflected tensions between personal choices and institutional norms. Suleiman's reign ended during a military campaign in Hungary in 1566. He had continued to direct operations late in life, and his presence on campaign reflected a sustained commitment to overseeing military matters personally. He died on the march, and his passing was followed by ritual arrangements for burial and for the transfer of power. He was interred in the mosque complex he had built in Istanbul, where his tomb remains part of a larger charitable center. Assessing Suleiman's place in history involves a balance of accomplishments and costs. Under his rule, the Ottoman state consolidated legal structures, expanded its territories in Europe and the Middle East, and developed a rich pattern of architectural and cultural patronage. Central administration grew more systematic, and trade and urban life benefited from public investment. At the same time, military campaigns brought destruction in some regions and required constant mobilization of manpower and resources. Court politics could be severe, and the choices made about succession had long-term effects. In the decades after his death, the institutions and patterns established under Suleiman continued to shape Ottoman governance. Law codes and administrative practices persisted. The built environment, from mosques to bridges to hospitals, continued to serve everyday functions. Cultural achievements created reference points for later generations of artists and scholars. Over time, historians and contemporaries debated the meaning of his reign, weighing legal and administrative advances against the human and political costs of expansion. In a straightforward sense, Suleiman's rule stands as a period in which the Ottoman state sought to combine military power, legal order, and cultural investment in order to manage a vast and diverse domain. The record of that effort remains visible in laws, buildings, and archival traces that scholars continue to examine and interpret. Louis XIV was born into a royal house that had already shaped much of France's recent history. He arrived in 1638 as the son of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. His father ruled with the help of ministers and advisors who sought to strengthen royal authority after years of conflict. The young prince spent his earliest years in an environment shaped by court ritual, religious observance, and the careful management of power. When his father died in 1643, the child became king, but he was not able to govern on his own. His mother assumed the regency, and a series of advisors and ministers guided the kingdom while he grew older. The regency years carried a mixture of continuity and crisis. Cardinal Mazarin emerged as the leading minister and continued much of the centralizing work that his predecessor, Cardinal Richelieu, had begun. State institutions were refined, and the monarchy maintained its role in directing policy. At the same time, France experienced internal unrest in a series of uprisings known as the Fronde. These disturbances involved nobles, parliaments, and urban groups who resisted certain measures of royal authority and fiscal policy. The Fronde ended without overturning the royal government, yet it left a lasting impression on the young monarch. Those early experiences helped shape the outlook Louis would bring to the throne. Growing up amid noble rivalries and court intrigues, he observed how disorder interrupted governance and how reliance on intermediaries could weaken central control. Over time, he concluded that a stable state required stronger, more direct leadership from the crown. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, the king made a deliberate choice to assume personal control of government. He dismissed several ministers and set the tone for a long period of active royal rule. That moment marked a transition from regency to the sustained centralization of authority. One of the most visible expressions of Louis's policy was the transformation of a modest hunting lodge at Versailles into an extensive royal palace and court. Initially, the estate served as a place outside Paris where kings could hunt and withdraw from city life. Louis chose to enlarge and reshape the site. In this way, Versailles became more than a residence. It became a center for government, ceremony, and the life of the court. Architects and artists worked under royal direction for decades. Gardens were laid out with careful geometry and long vistas. New wings and galleries extended the palace into a complex of halls, chambers, and public spaces designed to receive ministers, ambassadors, and visitors. The construction of Versailles had practical intentions as well as aesthetic ones. By moving the court to a location under direct royal control, Louis could draw the nobility into a regular pattern of attendance and obligation. Daily rituals, such as the king's rising and retiring, were arranged so that nobles could observe and participate in moments that conferred status. In this way, the palace became a mechanism for supervising the elite. Officials and courtiers had opportunities to show loyalty, to seek favors, and to secure offices. Meanwhile, the king maintained careful oversight of appointments and finances. Over time, Versailles worked as a political instrument that reduced the independence of powerful provincial magnates by tying their prestige to presence at court. Life at Versailles involved strict rules of etiquette and protocol. The king's household followed routines that structured social relations and public behavior. Those protocols were recorded, taught, and enforced. In practical terms, they shaped how power and privilege were distributed. Courtiers who learned to navigate the system could advance their careers. Others found the demands expensive and exacting. The maintenance of the palace itself required significant resources. Craftsmen, gardeners, and domestic staff worked in large numbers to sustain daily life. The workshops and manufactories that supplied furniture, textiles, and decorative objects expanded under royal commission, so that the court also became a center of production and consumption. Versailles carried cultural as well as political weight. The literary and musical life of the court attracted writers, composers, and performers. Playwrights and dramatists presented works at court theaters. Composers created ballets and operas that suited ceremonial occasions. Painters and sculptors executed portraits and decorations that commemorated royal achievement. Academies and institutions received royal support and patronage. Scientific inquiry and artistic training benefited from steady funding. In this way, the court influenced trends in language, manners, and taste across France and beyond. Louis's approach to governance extended beyond the palace. He aimed to consolidate what historians call absolute monarchy, a system in which the king exercised broad authority over law, taxation, and administration. In practical terms, this meant strengthening royal institutions and reducing the capacity of local powers to act independently. The office of the intendant, already in use before his personal rule, expanded its scope. Intendants acted as the crown's representatives in the provinces, overseeing tax collection, policing, and judicial matters. They reported back to ministers in Paris and followed instructions from central authorities. Over time, these officials helped create a more uniform system of administration. At the same time, the crown maintained and developed legal structures that affirmed royal prerogatives. The king's courts and councils handled matters of justice and policy. In this framework, the monarch aimed to be the final arbiter of disputes and a guarantor of public order. Ministers, secretaries of state, and councils coordinated policy across different regions and departments. The system depended on competent administrators and on a flow of information between the provinces and the center. For administrators who supported royal designs, the court at Versailles served as the ultimate forum for recognition. Economic policy was another area where the crown sought to increase its control. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who became one of Louis's principal ministers, shaped a program of fiscal and commercial reform. He promoted manufacturing, textile production, and state-sponsored industries. Government support for workshops and guilds aimed to raise the quality of French goods and to increase exports. Meanwhile, customs duties and trade regulations were adjusted to favor domestic production. Colbert also pursued measures to improve state revenues and to oversee royal finances. Roads, ports, and canals received attention as practical supports for trade. In this way, economic policy was meant to undergird France's political and military capacity. Religious policy played a significant role in royal consolidation. Louis believed that religious unity could strengthen royal authority. In 1685, he issued the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, a decree that had previously granted limited toleration to Protestants. The revocation ended legal recognition for Protestant worship in France and imposed new restrictions. The policy produced a clear shift in the religious landscape. Many Protestants chose to emigrate rather than to comply with the new demands. Skilled workers, merchants, and artisans left the kingdom, and their departure had economic and social consequences. The royal government framed the decision as a matter of uniformity and order. Critics argued about the costs and the moral implications, but the move reflected the broader aim of consolidating authority under a single church and a single crown. Military and diplomatic activity were central to Louis's policy of influence and security. His reign saw a series of conflicts aimed at expanding territory, securing borders, or asserting French power. Campaigns on land and operations at sea involved sustained mobilization of armies and fleets. Successes and setbacks occurred in different theaters. The king negotiated alliances, arranged marriages, and engaged in diplomacy that linked France to other European states. Over the course of decades, France emerged as a leading power on the continent, and its position affected the calculations of neighbors and rivals. Those developments influenced the wider European balance of power. French art, language, and manners gained prestige, and French courts adopted elements of style that originated at Versailles. Ambassadors reported on the rhythms of court life, and monarchs watched how royal ritual structured social order. Academies, theaters, and academies of sciences received models and sometimes direct encouragement from French institutions. Meanwhile, political leaders adjusted their responses to growing French might with coalitions and diplomatic arrangements aimed at limiting unilateral expansion. The cultural influence of Louis's reign reached into architecture, garden design, painting, music, and literature. Architects and planners developed a language of form and proportion that was associated with French classicism. Gardens laid out with geometric clarity and axial lines influenced approaches to landscape elsewhere. Painters produced portraits that emphasized status and character, while composers and dramatists adapted forms for court entertainment. The French language moved toward a dominant role in diplomacy and in the educated circles of Europe. In this way, cultural policies and patronage contributed both to internal cohesion and to a broader international presence. Over time, the costs of sustaining court life, of maintaining large armies, and of pursuing territorial ambitions mounted. Taxes, forced labor in the form of corvée for public works, and requisitions placed heavy burdens on many parts of society. Administrators tried to balance fiscal demands with the need to avoid open unrest. Occasional reforms sought to rationalize revenue collection, but fiscal strain remained a persistent challenge. Those pressures had long-term effects on the financial health of the state and on popular attitudes toward government. Louis's personal role in representation and ceremony remained central until the end of his life. His long reign extended from childhood into advanced age, and he maintained active involvement in state business for many decades. He shaped institutions, cultivated the arts, and pursued policies intended to secure France's position in Europe. At the same time, his choices produced mixed results. The centralization of authority created a strong and orderly framework of rule. Yet that order rested on social obligations and fiscal arrangements that were not evenly sustainable for all parts of society. When historians assess Louis XIV, they face a complex record. He strengthened royal government and left a material legacy of buildings, academies, and administrative forms. French culture and language gained an international reach during his reign. Conversely, religious uniformity, foreign wars, and the burdens of court life had consequences that reached beyond his time. Debates about his achievements continue. Some emphasize state building and cultural leadership, while others stress social costs and the limits of long-term fiscal sustainability. The legacy of his reign remains visible in many settings. Versailles stands as an enduring center of art, history, and memory. The institutions that developed under his patronage continued to shape French cultural life for generations. Administrative practices and legal precedents influenced later rulers, and in some cases, were adapted by other states. At the same time, the social and economic strains associated with the late 17th and early 18th centuries fed into discussions about reform that emerged in later decades. In a calm and steady view, Louis XIV's rule can be understood as an effort to reorder political life around a centralized, ceremonial, and administratively coherent monarchy. He sought to provide stability through a network of officials, a court that gathered leading figures of society, and a cultural program that projected French achievements. The results were significant and sometimes contradictory. Over time, they shaped France's place in Europe and left a record that scholars and citizens have continued to examine. That record offers a way to understand how a single long reign could combine institution building, artistic patronage, and international ambition into a durable pattern of rule. Frederick II of Prussia was born in January 1712 into a royal family that expected discipline and service. His father, Frederick William I, ruled with a strict hand and placed a heavy emphasis on order, military readiness, and thrift. From an early age, the young prince received a rigorous education. Tutors taught him languages, history, law, and the arts. He learned French and Latin. He read classical authors. At the same time, he pursued music and wrote poetry. Those interests set him apart from his father's strict conception of what a prince should be. The relationship with his father became a defining feature of Frederick's early life. Conflicts arose over the prince's tastes and companions. The court valued soldierly virtues above all, while Frederick preferred literature and music. Meanwhile, pressure from his father increased. In 1730, the prince attempted to escape the court. He planned a flight with a close friend and fellow officer, Hans Hermann von Katt. The attempt failed. Arrest followed, and the consequences were severe. Katt was executed. Frederick himself was sentenced to death, but was spared. Instead, he endured imprisonment and humiliation. In this way, his early years were shaped by both intellectual curiosity and sharp personal suffering. Those experiences left a lasting imprint on his character and his later decisions. After his release, Frederick adapted to the demands of palace life. He learned to navigate a system that valued obedience to the crown. Marriage followed in 1733 with Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a union arranged for dynastic reasons. The marriage produced no deep personal companionship, but it fulfilled the political expectations of the monarchy. As time passed, Frederick developed a clearer sense of his role as prince and later as sovereign. He continued to read widely. He corresponded with writers and thinkers of the period. Voltaire became one of his best-known correspondents and visitors. Those intellectual connections contributed to a public image of a ruler who combined military command with cultural interests. Frederick came to the throne in 1740. The wider European scene offered opportunities and challenges. The Habsburg monarchy faced questions of succession, and territorial arrangements were in flux. Frederick acted decisively. He moved to secure Silesia, a prosperous province that lay to Prussia's south. That choice drew Prussia into a series of conflicts, beginning with the War of the Austrian Succession. Success in that war helped establish Prussia as a major power in Central Europe, and it set the stage for later confrontations. The 7 Years' War, which began in 1756, presented one of Frederick's most severe tests. Europe divided into competing coalitions. Prussia found itself aligned with Great Britain, while major continental powers opposed it, including Austria, France, and Russia. The strategic situation was difficult. Prussia was relatively small in territory and population compared with some of its enemies. It had to fight on several fronts at once. For months and years, the outcome seemed uncertain. Military leadership during the war required constant movement and quick decisions. Frederick relied on careful planning, rapid marches, and the discipline of his troops. At times, his armies achieved remarkable victories. The battles of Rossbach and Leuthen in 1757 became notable examples. In those engagements, Prussian forces defeated numerically superior opponents. The victories preserved core territories and lifted morale. Yet the war also brought serious setbacks. At Kolin, in 1757, the Prussian army suffered defeat. In 1759, the Battle of Kunersdorf ended in disaster, with heavy losses and a near collapse of the Prussian position. The situation then looked perilous. Political and diplomatic events outside the battlefield also influenced the war's course. In 1762, the death of Russian Empress Elizabeth brought a sudden change. Her successor, Peter III, admired Frederick and quickly reversed Russia's hostile policy. In this way, a major threat to Prussia disappeared almost overnight. The withdrawal of Russian forces relieved pressure on the Eastern Front and allowed Prussia to regain its footing. The war finally concluded in 1763 with treaties that left Prussia in possession of Silesia. The cost had been high in men and resources, but the state survived as a major power. The demands of long conflict shaped Frederick's thinking about administration and society. In the years that followed, he devoted attention to domestic reform. He sought to strengthen the state's capacity to govern and to extract resources without provoking unnecessary unrest. In practical terms, that meant streamlining the bureaucracy, improving tax collection, and encouraging agricultural and industrial development. Administrators received clearer instructions. Provincial offices were reorganized to improve efficiency. Over time, those changes produced a more centralized and capable state apparatus. Economic policy took a pragmatic form. The government promoted settlement and cultivation of land, invested in roads and canals, and offered incentives to skilled immigrants and artisans. Prussia welcomed skilled workers who could contribute to industry and trade. Meanwhile, efforts to increase production included support for new factories and the improvement of existing industries. The aim was to build a stronger economic base that could sustain both civilian needs and military commitments. Legal and judicial reforms were another area of change. Frederick adopted a generally rational approach to law. He reduced the use of arbitrary punishments in many cases and moved to limit the use of torture in criminal procedures. Courts were expected to apply clearer standards. That emphasis on clarity and order aligned with broader aims of enlightened governance. At the same time, the king retained strong control over law and policy. He did not yield power to representative bodies, and the institutions of the state remained oriented toward top-down authority. In this way, his rule combined reformist impulses with continued autocratic command. Religious policy under Frederick reflected a practical tolerance. The state permitted multiple confessions to practice their religion. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews found spaces in which to live and work, though restrictions persisted in certain areas. The government often welcomed religious minorities when they brought skills or capital. Over time, a measure of pluralism developed in Prussian towns and provinces. That pluralism supported economic recovery and social stability after long years of war. Education and culture also received royal support. The king maintained patronage of music, literature, and science. He played the flute, composed music, and maintained a court where intellectuals and artists could find support. Academies and learned societies benefited from royal backing. Meanwhile, the state promoted elementary instruction in certain districts and encouraged technical training. The combination of cultural patronage and practical education aimed to foster a competent civil service and an educated military officer corps. Frederick's approach to governance fits within the category historians call enlightened absolutism. He believed in the value of reasoned reform and of policies that increased state capacity. He expected rulers to act for the benefit of the state, measured by order, prosperity, and security. Yet he retained the principle that ultimate authority rested with the monarch. He made choices that expanded the state's power and improved administration. But he also preserved many traditional privileges for the aristocracy. In practice, he relied on the nobility for military leadership and for local administration. Those arrangements created both stability and limits to deeper social change. The long-term effects of Frederick's reign shaped Prussian identity. Militarily, the state acquired a reputation for discipline, training, and efficiency. The army became a central institution in political life and in public memory. Administratively, the emphasis on merit and clear instruction influenced the growing bureaucracy. Officials were trained to follow regulations and to execute centralized policy. Economically, the acquisition of Silesia brought important resources and contributed to industrial growth. Demographic and economic policies encouraged the development of towns and the expansion of productive land. Cultural legacies persisted as well. The king's support for the arts and learning helped establish institutions that lasted beyond his reign. The German language and Prussian legal practices developed recognizable forms. At the same time, the social order remained hierarchical. Serfdom persisted in much of the countryside, and social mobility was limited. The dual legacy combined modern state building with enduring social inequalities. Over time, Frederick's image became a touchstone for later generations. Some remembered him primarily as a victorious commander and state builder. Others emphasized his role as a patron of the arts and a man of letters. Still others criticized the social costs of militarization and of strong central authority. In the 19th century, the memory of his reign contributed to debates about national unity and military power. Institutions and administrative habits created in the 18th century played a role in later political developments on the German lands. When historians examine Frederick's life, they find a complex record. His early struggles with family and expectation shaped a ruler who combined sensitivity to ideas with a capacity for firm action. Military campaigns, most notably the 7 Years' War, tested and ultimately confirmed Prussia's place among European powers. Domestic reforms strengthened state structures and encouraged economic and cultural growth, while leaving important social hierarchies in place. Over time, these elements came together to form a distinctive Prussian identity, one centered on discipline, service, and an efficient administration. In a calm assessment, Frederick the Great appears as a ruler who sought to build a durable state. He relied on military strength and administrative skill. He promoted arts and learning. He adopted reformist measures while preserving monarchical authority. The consequences were mixed, but they were significant. They shaped the political map of Central Europe and influenced how successive generations understood Prussia's role. That complex legacy continued to matter long after his death in 1786, and it remains a subject of study for those who wish to trace the origins of modern state institutions and national identity. Peter Alexeyevich was born into a world that still looked inward. The realm usually called Muscovy had grown over centuries by conquest and consolidation. It retained older forms of rule, older social patterns, and older ways of organizing power. The boy who later took the name Peter grew up amid this mixture of tradition and pressure for change. He was the son of Tsar Alexis and one of his wives. Family life was complicated. Rivalries among relatives, fragile alliances at court, and religious factions shaped his earliest years. A half-brother, Ivan, shared the throne in name for a time, and a regent, Sophia, exercised power during Peter's youth. Those surrounding tensions left a mark. They taught him how force and persuasion could shape events. They also showed him the limits of inherited authority when it met disorder. As a child and young man, Peter showed practical interests. He served with soldiers and sailors from a young age. He enjoyed being with craftsmen and engineers. In the ships and workshops that he visited, he watched how things were made and how they worked. Over time, he formed a clear sense of a need he would express throughout his life. Russia lacked a strong navy, modern artillery, efficient factories, and the kinds of institutions that sustained European states. Peter's curiosity took a practical turn. He wanted tools and techniques as much as ideas. He wanted officers who knew European drill and sailors who could handle large ships. He wanted administrators who understood accounting and supply. In this way, his youthful habits of attention to detail grew into a general plan of reform. In the late 1690s, Peter left Russia on a long diplomatic and observational tour known as the Grand Embassy. He traveled under a modest name and mixed with shipbuilders, engineers, and court officials in several European ports. He visited Holland, England, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. He watched shipyards and dockyards at work. He studied fortifications and military drill. He sought out scientific instruments and books. Meanwhile, he negotiated for allies and for craftsmen willing to work in his service. The mission was imperfect as a diplomatic success, but it achieved another aim. Peter returned with practical knowledge and new contacts. He had also seen at first hand how states organized industry, financed armies, and supported the sciences. Those impressions reinforced his growing conviction that Russia needed deliberate policies to close a technical and administrative gap with the West. Peter's ambitions took shape in several directions at once. Military reform came first and often. He created regiments trained on European models, introduced new drills, and insisted on discipline. Conscription and long service terms increased the size of the army. He paid particular attention to artillery and to logistics. A navy became a central project. Russia had little experience of large warships. Peter ordered the construction of fleets and learned the trade of shipbuilding himself. He recruited foreign shipwrights and officers, and he set up shipyards on the Baltic and on rivers further inland. Over time, a blue water navy emerged where none had existed before. In this way, the state gained the means to project power by sea and to protect its coastlines and trade. One of Peter's most visible projects was St. Petersburg. He had long sought access to a sea that opened to Europe, and the conflict with Sweden provided an opening. In 1703, on a site where a Swedish fort once stood, he ordered the construction of a new city designed to command the Neva estuary and to give Russia a Baltic port. He named it with a Western sound and set out to build European-style streets, docks, and fortifications. The site was difficult. Much of the land lay low and wet, and winter conditions could be severe. Workers had to drain marshes, drive piles for foundations, and haul stone and timber by boat. The labor came from many sources: soldiers, conscripted peasants, prisoners, and foreign specialists. Houses rose quickly, but so did sickness and hardship. Thousands suffered, and many died during the first years of construction. Yet the project continued with insistence. Peter moved quickly to establish administrative buildings, shipyards, and military works. Over time, the layout acquired a recognizable pattern of canals, canal-side buildings, and government institutions. In 1712, the court began to spend more of its time in the new city, and in the years that followed, St. Petersburg took on a formal role as the state's outward-facing capital. The decision to found and to favor St. Petersburg also made a larger point about Peter's aims. He wanted Russia to be present in the same waters where other European powers operated. He wanted ports, merchant ships, and naval bases under Russian control. In this way, the city served both strategic and symbolic purposes. It anchored northern expansion and helped to integrate conquered territories into a different administrative system. Meanwhile, St. Petersburg became a place where European styles of architecture, court life, and administration were encouraged. Noble families were invited to build houses there. Officials from Moscow were asked to move. Over time, the court's relocation changed the political geography of the realm. Moscow remained a spiritual and historical center, but St. Petersburg became the stage where a new, outward-looking Russia asserted itself. These northern ambitions were part of a broader pattern of territorial expansion and military engagement. The long conflict known as the Great Northern War pitted Russia against Sweden and its allies. Early in the war, Peter suffered a serious setback at Narva in 1700. The defeat was a hard lesson in logistics and command. He responded by reorganizing his forces, by improving supply lines, and by deepening his reliance on foreign officers and engineers. The decisive turn came in 1709 at Poltava, on Ukrainian soil, where a Swedish invasion force under Charles XII met a Russian army that had been trained and reformed. Victory at Poltava marked a shift in regional balance. Sweden's military dominance in the Baltic waned. Over the next decade, Russia secured access to the Baltic Sea and acquired important territories along its shores. The formal end of the war, sealed in treaties in the early 1720s, recognized Russia as a major power in Northern Europe and opened maritime trade in ways previously denied. Peter's expansionist aims also reached to the south. He launched campaigns against Ottoman positions and made attempts to secure access to the Black Sea. The capture of Azov in the 1690s showed a capacity to project force in the south. The results were mixed. Naval bases were harder to maintain in the face of powerful Ottoman fleets and entrenched coastal defenses. Still, those southern ventures forced the state to think in wider terms about diplomacy, supply, and the organization of frontier zones. Over time, the drive to secure ports and commercial routes became a constant theme in Russian policy. Within the state, Peter reorganized authority. He created new administrative bodies and reorganized old ones. In 1711, he established a governing senate to act as a permanent administrative council. Later, he replaced the old system of prikazy, or central offices, with a set of colleges. Each college supervised a particular function: foreign affairs, war, commerce, and so on. These institutions followed clearer rules for record keeping and for decision procedures. Governors were appointed to newly defined districts, and provincial administration took on a more consistent shape. Over time, these reforms aimed to reduce arbitrariness in governance and to make officials more accountable to central direction. They also increased the capacity of the state to collect revenue, to mobilize troops, and to regulate trade. Taxation and fiscal policy underwent major change. Peter introduced a poll tax that taxed individuals rather than land, and he sought to broaden the tax base. Revenues were used to support the expanding military and the construction of infrastructure. The burden fell unevenly, however. Peasants and urban workers often found tax demands heavy, while nobles were expected to serve in the military or the administration in exchange for certain privileges. These arrangements reinforced a hierarchical social order, even as they created new forms of service to the state. Social and cultural reforms accompanied administrative change. Peter insisted that the nobility adopt Western dress and manners, and he discouraged certain traditional practices. A famous example was the beard tax, introduced to push male elites toward clean-shaven styles common in Western Europe. Nobles were called to serve in the army, in the navy, or in the civil service. Over time, the state created incentives for technical training. Schools were open to teach navigation, engineering, and mathematics. The Academy of Sciences, founded near the end of Peter's life, aimed to foster scientific learning and to support practical knowledge crucial for industry and military affairs. Meanwhile, Peter sent many young Russians abroad to study, to be apprentices, or to learn trades. In this way, a new professional layer began to form that was not entirely dependent on birth. The church's status also changed. Peter curtailed the independence of the patriarchate and replaced it with a holy synod that operated under state supervision. In this way, church administration came under tighter control, and the institution's political role was reshaped. The reforms aimed to align religious administration with the needs of the modernizing state, while leaving religious practice in place for the population. Industry and infrastructure became central concerns. Peter encouraged mining, metallurgy, and textile production. He invited foreign technicians and established factories under state or private patronage. Roads and canals received attention, as did the building of ports and shipyards. In practical terms, the state invested in workshops for guns, in foundries for cannons and anchors, and in the glass and shipbuilding trades. Over time, these investments produced a modest industrial base, more suited to supporting a large army and a growing naval force. Peter also changed succession rules and the political culture of leadership. He insisted on a stronger central authority and left instructions that the monarch could determine a successor. That decision had long-term consequences for political stability because it placed the question of succession in the hands of individuals rather than in automatic hereditary order. For some years after his death, this produced struggles and uncertainty at the top of the state. The price of Peter's reforms was often high. War, forced labor, and heavy taxation brought suffering to many. The rapid pace of change unsettled traditional elites and common folk alike. Yet in the state structures, military capabilities, and cities that emerged, one can see a new Russia taking shape. It was a state with capacity for large-scale projects, with a navy and army trained for European warfare, and with administrative institutions that could manage wider territories and more complex economies. When Peter died in 1725, the map of Russia and its standing in Europe had changed. The realm stood with a new port on the Baltic, with standing forces trained by modern standards, and with a set of institutions designed to sustain a larger and more active state. Over time, those changes influenced Russia's interactions with neighboring powers and with European politics. They also shaped internal debates about authority, service, and the balance between tradition and reform. Historians look at Peter's reign and see a period of determined transformation. He used force and fiat when necessary, and he harnessed knowledge and practical skills to remold his country. The results were mixed in human terms and clear in institutional terms. In the calm arc of history, Peter's era marks a turning point where Muscovy moved decisively toward becoming an empire shaped by new tools of warfare, administration, and economy.